guest is Mr. Metacognition himself, Nathan Burns. Nathan is joining us this morning to discuss what is metacognition in education as a term, and the phenomenon of what this looks like in the classroom environment. Nathan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to talk about metacognition today.
Brilliant. So, a few things I'm going to ask for the benefit of educators, hopefully around the country, up and down in FE, possibly in schools as well. So, firstly, Nathan, in your perspective and your experience, what is the term metacognition?
So you've started off with the most difficult question, I think, because it's always the question, what actually is metacognition? It's a phrase that we've used for years and years and years, and I feel like sometimes it means learning to learn, sometimes it means thinking about thinking, sometimes it means exam prep, it means this, it means that, and I think it's become a very confused term, and if you ask 10 different people, you'll probably get 10 different responses to what it is. Now, in terms of the definition that I use, I go back to the literature. John Flavel wrote about metacognition 50 years ago now. Actually, this was 1976, and he gave a definition that I still think is the clearest and the crispest at understanding exactly what it means. So Flavel said that you're being metacognitive if you realize that you're having more difficulty learning A than B, and if you pause to consider C before accepting it as fact. So in terms of that definition, I'm having more difficulty learning A than B. Why am I struggling? What is proving a challenge here? What is it that I don't know? What is it that I don't understand? Well, on the flip side, why am I doing so much better with this section B? Why am I managing to achieve so well? Why have I got 10 out of 10? So it's about that deep evaluation of, well, how have I prepared? What's my understanding like? How have I moved through the task, and so what was good and what needs to stay the same moving forwards, and what do I need to work on? But he also mentions that double checking C before accepting it as fact, and I think that's often a sort of an ignored part of what metacognition is, because we're consistently bringing in new information to our mental models, into our subject schemas, and sometimes we get told something or we see something, we go, that I wasn't expecting that. I didn't think that would be the case. The example I always use in the classroom is, imagine now if all of the listeners were doing a quick maths test and it had 10 questions in it, and imagine now that the first 9 answers were positive numbers and they were whole numbers. So you had the answer 2, the answer 5, 7, whatever it might be. We'll call them nice numbers. But then imagine the 10th question, you got the answer negative 3.7 reoccurring. Before handing in that quiz sheet, you'd probably stop and check your answer, wouldn't you? Like, it just doesn't follow the pattern. It just doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't fit in with your expectation. Now, to pause and to check and to reflect, that's also deeply metacognitive. And I think now more than ever, that really matters, because we live in a world of AI, and AI is now everywhere. Like, it really feels in the last 12 to 18 months we've gone from, oh yeah, I know that's AI because that person's got 3 arms and 20 fingers on each hand. So now you can watch videos and you go, is that AI or is this real? Like, it's so good now. But actually that pause to go, is this real? Are these facts likely to be true? Do I believe what I'm reading? How can I double check that that's correct? All of this sort of critical thinking that we need to do now with it. I mean, you can't scroll through your phone without seeing AI videos and scratching your head and going, is this real? Is it not? So that ability to pause and not just accept everything that we read or everything that we see as, oh, that must be true. That consideration is also part of what it means to be metacognitive. And I think that's a really important additional consideration when we define metacognition. It's not just thinking about thinking. It encapsulates all of that process of doing, of reflecting, of monitoring, of planning, and it also considers how we build our schemas and our mental models, and what we accept to be true and what we challenge and push back on, because it just doesn't follow the pattern.
Amazing insight there, Nathan. Thank you for that. I think on the ground in the classroom, I think a couple of things that teachers can look at doing then, in terms of transferring that learner mindset to thinking, actually, how do I know that? What did I do in my mind to make me think about that? And how do I know I'm accurate, but also to boost that reliability then of thinking over a longer term period of time, teachers can actually look at thinking, well, how do you know? Can you justify that? Can you share with the group or share with a peer how you know that?
Yeah.
And can you show them? Can you talk them through how you've actually got to that answer? And if you do that over a longer period of time as a teacher, it becomes classroom routine, and your learners can become a bit more conditioned at thinking
Yeah.
in those manners. But
And
yeah,
yeah, I think that's a huge thing. It's not about hearing stuff from students and saying you're wrong or that can't possibly be true, but rather going, well, why do you believe that? Why have you interpreted it in that way? What evidence do you have? What additional argument can you make that backs up? Because that's what makes a high quality essay. That's what makes a good problem solving individual. That's what makes a good project, to think through the options, to interrogate them, and to go, well, this is the one I'm choosing because it's that rationale behind it as well, which is so important.
absolutely. Yeah. So coming back to you then, Nathan. So in your experience, can you give us a couple of top tips on how teachers can incorporate a couple of, highly impactful metacognitive strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. So to begin with, I think that the most teacher-led thing we can do is our everyday modeling. We're always modeling to our students, aren't we? Like every time we're stood at the front of the room, every time we go and work with small groups, every time we're one-to-one with a student because they're struggling with something, we're consistently modeling. Now we're experts in the room. We know our stuff. And what makes us an expert is that we've studied the topic for far longer than our students have. We understand it in a far greater depth than our students do now, and potentially may ever. We understand the curriculum. We can actually remember everything that's come before. We know everything that's coming in advance. We know the examiner reports. We know what assessments look like. We know what makes a good assessment. We know all of these things, right? We're experts, and we've been through this over and over and over. Now, by virtue of being an expert, we also have deeply ingrained high quality metacognitive skills. I often think of teachers and educators as like metacognitive beasts. We know all of these metacognitive things that our novice learners just don't. So the more time we take to explicitly draw attention to our decision making process is really important. So I like to think of it as explicit justification. If we're doing something in our modeling that is obvious and automatic for us, but our students don't necessarily know why, we ought to draw attention to it. So if I was to model something in maths now, maybe I would focus on a particular word, congruent or parallel. Well, I'm explaining not just, oh, I'm looking at this word, I'm looking at this word because it's about understanding how we as an expert decode things. It's about students being able to see the metacognition and the metacognitive processes that we're going through, because at the end of the day, metacognition is a very hidden process. I mean, it's hard enough most of the time to understand what learning has been going on, and we've got great techniques to do that. But to understand the decision-making process and the thoughts that students are going through, it's so hard to make visible. So yeah, first thing is we're making sure that we, as experts, are explaining our thoughts. But so every time we choose a strategy or focus on a keyword or draw in knowledge or lay out our work in a particular way or tackle a project in a particular manner, those decisions where they're not automatic and obvious to our learners, that's the metacognitive gap that we're trying to fill in. So that's the first thing that I would always say is this is what you can do from tomorrow in your classroom straight away. No resources, nothing new, but just making sure you're being explicit. And then I think the second thing that we can do is around feedback. Now, I'm a huge feedback is so important. I'm not about to say that it isn't important. That would be very controversial. But actually, what's really important about feedback is that it actually gets used. So we spend so much time talking about high quality feedback. What does it look like? How frequently is it given? What format? I think we've moved past like the stamps and the double marking and all that stuff. But we've been there, right? That's the debate we've had over the last 2 decades or so. But none of that matters if students don't act on the feedback. Like, what is the point of giving feedback if students don't have the time to engage with it, or learners never actually reflect upon it, or they never put it into practice? Like, there's no point going over some answers right at the end of the lesson, giving a bit of feedback, and then all the students go, because by the time they're back with you, they'll have forgotten. You can literally give them a 10-minute break. They'll come back and they'll have forgotten it all because they've not started to build it into their schema. They've not started to activate it. And that's a hugely metacognitive thing, because metacognition in terms of regulation is planning, monitoring, and evaluation. But that evaluation has to then inform the planning. So one of the things I always challenge staff to is, well, how are you activating that feedback? How are you making students use that? So one very simple thing that we can do is, once we've given students feedback on a particular project, task, question, assessment, is actually get them to plan out their response to a very similar task, or even sometimes the same task. Like, they've done a task, they've worked all the way through, they've got their feedback. Well, actually, now, before we move on, or before we leave for a break, you're going to have 5 minutes, you're going to have 6 minutes, you're going to have 10 minutes. Here's a similar question, or actually, here's the same question again. Write out a plan that builds in the feedback that I've just given you. Because that's the dual benefit of learners are instantly utilizing that feedback, and instantly they know what they need to do better. They're beginning to assimilate that new information. And it also shows how important planning is, because that's kind of a side benefit. Students don't like to plan. Humans don't like to plan, right? It's long, it's tedious, it's boring. But actually, if we build that into the feedback process, that feedback feeds forward into effective planning, well, it doesn't feel like a chore. It feels like the next step in the journey. So that's, I quite like that, sort of like, sort of almost like the do it again. You've done the task. Here's your feedback. Plan it out again. And then I'm not going to make you do it, but you've planned it out. You've begun to activate that feedback.
Again, some excellent insight there, Nathan. Thank you for that. Again, some really good top tips for teachers to start utilising there. Number one being the fact that, how can I get my learners thinking more deeply and more critically? So, reflection activities at the end of tasks, maybe, group discussions whereby they have to debate and compare their approaches to how they've succeeded within particular tasks. I'm just going to go on to another topic now, Nathan, in terms of, I've read some research about a month ago on Dr. Carl Hendrick suggesting that if learners aren't critically thinking for a continued period within a lesson, they're not actually learning. So they may be prone to looking busy, lots of nodding heads, lots of interactivity with other peers and learners, and even a teacher, even active learning around the classroom and going to different, maybe carousel learning and different learning stations, so to speak, and doing bits of jigsaw learning to bring learning together. But actually, how in agreement are you then that without the use and application of continued thinking within lessons, that learning does or doesn't take place? What's your thoughts on that?
I think this is where we come back to deliberate practice, isn't it? I always reflect on the quote that, I think it's probably about 10 or 15 years ago, it really hit sort of like the mainstream, like, 10,000 hours of doing anything makes you an expert in it. It's like, no, I've sung for 10,000 hours in the shower. No one wants to hear me sing. Like, it just, what matters is deliberate practice, is actually being purposeful in what you're doing. And I think this idea that you can be busy, you can be nodding along. And this isn't to say that students don't want to learn, but if they are nodding along and they're trying to listen and they're trying to make notes, none of these things necessarily make them think that deeply. They can be active without deeply thinking. And I think that's the crucial thing, that when we're getting students to complete work, to engage within our lessons, each bit of practice that we provide needs to be incredibly deliberate. We need to know what the purpose of that activity is. By virtue of doing this, what are the students going to be thinking about, and thus what skill is going to be improved, or what piece of knowledge are they going to get out of it, or what process are they going to become more accustomed to. So I think we can have busy looking classrooms, we can have really, it might seem like purposeful chatter, but if our students are just sort of going through the motions, or they're not being challenged, they're not learning. And I always think of learners like in a bubble. So if you imagine now that you're kind of like, you're within a bubble, we all know that if you hit a bubble, it pops. So what you don't want to do is have something that's ridiculously difficult. But we do, as learners, want them to be pushing out that bubble and gradually extending everything that they know. So if we're giving students tasks to do that sits firmly within their bubble of things that they can do, well, they're not learning anything new. They're not stretching. Whereas what we want to constantly do is that deep thinking, that slight challenge that's just outside their comfort zone. So they're gradually extending their bubbles more and more and more and more. That's what we're trying to do. So it's all about making sure that it's active and deep and deliberate. Let's not just do something because we know it should be helpful, but let's actually do something with purpose, have a really clear aim for a given task. And we and our learners should know the benefits of what that task will bring. By virtue of doing these questions, we are going to become more confident in understanding this process, or we're going to be able to reflect on why doing it this way might be more effective, having that clear purpose to each task.
Absolutely. I always say to trainees and lecturers as well that we're essentially, selling the course, selling our subject. We're salespeople, not just teachers.
Yeah.
We need to motivate and give a clear, purpose and insight into the value of the learning and how it can be used and how it can be fed forward and
Yeah.
utilized within future practice for employability and, skill development, professional behaviors and so forth. But I really believe that, without those metacognitive strategies that you've alluded to, it's very hard to break down that barrier of learners achieving or seeming to achieve in lessons,
Yeah.
and then when they reflect on it, they've got absolutely no idea of how they've
Yeah.
done it. They can't recall it, so then it
Yeah.
limits retrieval practice. There's lots of potential barriers of that moving forward. So yeah, thank you so much for your time this morning, Nathan, on the podcast. Hopefully listeners have been able to gain lots more insight and top tips into how they want to embed some different approaches within their techniques around the classroom to boost metacognition for learners, to guide understanding, to guide reflective practice, to make learners be more critical thinkers, which will drive their level of learning in the long term. So again, thank you for your time this morning, Nathan.
No,
You take
thank you
care.
so much for having me.
Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.